hospital morgue was always cold, but tonight it felt especially frigid. Dr. Claire Mitchell adjusted her lab coat and rubbed her hands together, trying to shake off the chill. She had been on shift since 8 p.m., and the clock on the wall now read 2:26 a.m. She was used to working late, alone in the basement of St. Helena's General Hospital. The faint hum of the refrigeration units and the steady tick of the clock were her only companions. Claire picked up her clipboard and walked over to the body storage drawers. She had one more autopsy to complete before her shift ended, a John Doe who had been brought in earlier that evening. Pulling the drawer open, Claire revealed the body of a man in his late 40s. His pale skin and lifeless expression gave her a familiar pang of melancholy. She had been doing this job for years, but something about this man unsettled her. As she prepared her tools, a faint sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping. She paused, holding her breath. The sound seemed to come from the far end of the morgue, near the double doors. "Probably just the pipes," she muttered, though her voice betrayed her unease. Returning to her work, she made the first incision. The scalpel's sharp edge glided through the man's chest, revealing the cold, still organs beneath. She worked methodically, her mind focused on the task at hand. But then she heard it again, a tapping, louder this time. Claire straightened up, her scalpel still in hand. "Hello? Is someone there?" she called out, her voice echoing in the empty room. No response. Suddenly the lights flickered. Claire's stomach tightened as the hum of the refrigeration unit sputtered and died. The morgue was plunged into near darkness, lit only by the dim emergency lights. More? Her pulse quickened. Power outages weren't uncommon in the old hospital, but they never failed to unnerve her. She reached for her flashlight, her fingers trembling slightly. Switching it on, she swept the beam across the room. The drawers were all closed, save for the one she was working on. The stainless steel counters gleamed faintly under the flashlight's beam. "Get a grip, Claire," she whispered, taking a deep breath. She turned back to the body, but her heart nearly stopped. The man's head was turned toward her, his eyes wide open. Claire stumbled back, her flashlight clattering to the floor. The beam spun wildly, casting unsettling shadows across the room. She pressed herself against the counter, her mind racing. "This isn't possible," she whispered. Summoning her courage, she retrieved the flashlight and shone it on the body. The man's eyes were closed again, his head in its original position. Claire's rational mind took over. "You're imagining things," she told herself. "It's just exhaustion." She returned to her workstation, determined to finish the autopsy quickly. But as she leaned over the body, the faint tapping sound began again, this time accompanied by a whisper. "Let me out." Claire froze. The voice was faint, barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakable. She whipped around, her flashlight darting toward the storage drawers. One of them was slightly ajar. The drawer was marked Unidentified Male -42. Claire hadn't opened it that night. In fact, it hadn't been accessed in weeks. Her breathing grew shallow as she approached. Gripping the handle, she hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to leave the room, to call for help. But she was a scientist, a woman of logic and reason. Taking a deep breath, she yanked the drawer open. It was empty. Her stomach churned as the whisper came again, louder this time. "Let me out." The voice wasn't coming from the drawer. It was behind her. Claire spun around, and her flashlight beam landed on a figure standing by the autopsy table. It was the John Doe. He stood upright, his pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light. His head tilted at an unnatural angle, and his eyes locked onto hers. "You shouldn't have disturbed me," he said, his voice raspy and hollow. Claire backed away, her legs trembling. This isn't real," she stammered. The man took a step toward her, his movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. Do you know what it's like to be forgotten, to be left in the dark? He reached out, his fingers long and bony. Claire turned and bolted for the door, her flashlight bouncing wildly. She slammed into the exit, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, overlapping, as if dozens of voices were speaking at once. Claire turned, her back against the door. The morgue was no longer empty. Figures stood by every storage drawer, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. They stared at her, unblinking. "You need to remember us," the John Doe said, stepping closer. The last thing Claire saw was his hand reaching for her throat as the room plunged into total darkness. The next morning, Claire's co-workers found the morgue in perfect order. The drawers were all closed, the lights functioning as usual. But Claire was gone. The only sign of her was her flashlight, lying in the center of the room, its beam pointed at an empty autopsy table. Emily adjusted her glasses, blinking at the faint glow of her computer screen. It was past midnight, and the office was eerily quiet. She glanced at her phone, 12:14 a.m. Her co-workers had left hours ago, their cheerful goodnights echoing through the now empty halls. She had stayed behind to finish a presentation due the next day. The office building was one of those towering modern structures with gleaming floors and endless rows of glass-walled offices. During the day, it buzzed with life, but at night, it transformed into a cold, lifeless shell. Emily stretched, saving her work before powering down her computer. Her desk lamp cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, and she felt a sudden chill. Brushing it off as exhaustion, she grabbed her bag and headed toward the elevator. The corridor leading to the elevator was dimly lit, with only half the lights functioning. Emily walked briskly, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. As she approached the elevator, a low hum caught her attention. She paused, listening. The sound grew louder, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It seemed to be coming from one of the offices she had just passed. Turning, she peered down the hallway. It was empty. Shaking her head, she muttered, "Stop freaking yourself out." She pressed the elevator button, the digital display above the doors flickering before settling on her floor number. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Emily stepped in, pressing the button for the lobby. As the doors slid shut, she exhaled, trying to relax. But the elevator didn't move. The lights flickered, and the elevator shuddered. Emily frowned, pressing the lobby button again. This time, the elevator began descending, but it stopped abruptly on the 8th floor. The doors opened with a mechanical groan. Beyond them was a dark, empty hallway. Emily squinted, trying to make out any movement. "Hello?" she called out hesitantly. No response. She reached for the close button, but just as the doors began to shut, a figure appeared at the far end of the hallway. It was a man in a janitor's uniform, standing perfectly still, staring at her. "Do you need to get in?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, as if studying her. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but something about his posture was unsettling. The doors closed, cutting off her view. Emily's heart raced as the elevator continued its descent. The elevator stopped again, this time on the 5th floor. The doors opened, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. The janitor was standing there, his face now fully visible. His eyes were hollow, lifeless, and his skin was unnaturally pale. He stepped into the elevator without a word, standing in the corner, facing the wall. Emily pressed herself against the opposite corner, clutching her bag tightly. The air in the elevator grew colder, and a faint metallic smell filled the space. "Late night?" she asked nervously, attempting to break the silence. The man didn't respond. Instead, he began humming, a low, tuneless sound that made her skin crawl. The elevator resumed its descent, but the display above the doors began glitching. The numbers flickered erratically, jumping from 3 to 6 to 2, before settling on 1. Suddenly, the elevator jolted to a stop. The lights flickered again, plunging them into darkness before the emergency lighting kicked in. Emily's chest tightened. She pressed the emergency call button, but there was no response. Turning to the janitor, she said, "Do you have a phone? We need to call for help." The man slowly turned to face her. His hollow eyes locked onto hers, and a chilling smile spread across his face. "You shouldn't have stayed late," he said, his voice low and distorted. Emily's knees buckled. She pressed herself against the wall, her fingers fumbling for her phone. Before she could unlock it, the man lunged toward her. Emily screamed as the elevator plummeted. The walls of the cabin groaned under the pressure, and the emergency lights flickered violently. When the elevator finally stopped, it was with a jarring thud. The doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit basement. Emily stumbled out, her legs trembling. The basement was unlike anything she had seen before. Rows of old, rusted filing cabinets lined the walls, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust. The janitor stepped out behind her, his movements unnaturally smooth. "Why are you doing this?" she cried, backing away. "You should have left when you had the chance," he replied. Behind him, shadows began to move. Dozens of figures emerged from the darkness, silent, pale, and hollow-eyed, just like the janitor. Emily turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. She spotted a stairwell and sprinted toward it, but as she reached for the door, a cold hand grabbed her shoulder. She spun around to see the janitor, his face inches from hers. His eyes bored into her as he whispered, "You'll never leave." The last thing Emily saw was a swarm of shadowy figures closing in around her. Jake Reynolds was no stranger to long, lonely nights on the road. With over a decade behind the wheel, he'd grown accustomed to the monotony of endless highways and the soothing hum of his truck's engine. But something about this particular stretch of road unsettled him. The Appalachian Highway, shrouded in thick fog, seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. The radio had lost its signal miles ago, leaving only the sound of the tires against the asphalt. The moon was hidden behind dense clouds, and the occasional silhouette of a barren tree flashed by his headlights, casting eerie shadows across the road. It was 1:47 a.m., according to the glowing clock on his dashboard. Jake rubbed his eyes, the fatigue of the night weighing heavily on him. He reached for his thermos, taking a sip of lukewarm coffee, when something caught his eye, a figure standing on the shoulder of the road, illuminated by his high beams. As Jake slowed his truck, the figure became clearer. It was a woman dressed in a flowing white dress that seemed out of place for the cold night. She stood perfectly still, her face hidden beneath her long, dark hair. Jake hesitated. He'd heard stories of hitchhikers gone wrong, but the woman looked vulnerable, lost. Against his better judgment, he pulled over. He rolled down the passenger side window. "You need a ride?" he asked, his voice echoing in the stillness. The woman nodded without speaking, her movements slow and deliberate. Jake unlocked the door and she climbed in silently. She carried no bag, no belongings, nothing but an air of quiet sorrow. "You okay, miss?" Jake asked as he merged back onto the highway. She turned to him, her pale face partially visible now. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "Thank you for stopping. I've been waiting a long time." Her voice was soft but carried an undertone that sent a chill down Jake's spine. He forced a smile. "No problem. Where are you headed?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to look out the window, her reflection in the glass oddly still, even as the truck bounced over the uneven road. The silence between them grew heavy. Jake tried to shake the discomfort by turning on the radio, but all he got was static. He glanced at the woman who was still staring out the window. So, been traveling long? He asked, trying to fill the void. This time she turned to him, her eyes locking onto his. They were dark, impossibly dark, like pools with no bottom. "You shouldn't have picked me up," she said, her voice barely audible over the static. Jake's hands tightened on the wheel. What's that supposed to mean? Before she could answer, the truck's headlights flickered, the dashboard lights dimmed, and the engine sputtered. Jake cursed under his breath, pulling over to the side of the road. He turned to the woman, but she was no longer in her seat. The passenger door was still locked, and the seatbelt lay twisted as if she'd never been there. Jake's heart raced. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the truck, the cold night air biting at his skin. He shone the beam around the truck, calling out, "Miss, where'd you go?" The beam of light swept across the empty road, landing on the woman standing a few yards ahead. Her dress billowed in a wind Jake couldn't feel. How'd you get out there?" he stammered. She raised her hand, pointing at him. Her voice was no longer soft. It echoed, deep and distorted. "You left me here before. Do you remember now?" Jake froze. The memory hit him like a freight train. Years ago, on this very highway, he had driven past a woman in a white dress. He had seen her waving for help but had ignored her, convincing himself it was too risky to stop. His knees weakened as the woman began walking toward him, her steps unnaturally smooth. I waited and waited for someone to help me, but no one came. Her face twisted, her features elongating into something grotesque. Her mouth opened wide, an inhuman scream filling the air. Jake stumbled back, scrambling into his truck. He locked the doors and started the engine, which roared to life despite its earlier sputtering. Slamming on the gas, he sped down the highway, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The woman was there, running after the truck, her distorted face illuminated by the red tail lights. No matter how fast Jake drove, she kept up, her figure growing larger in the mirror. The truck's radio crackled, her voice cutting through the static. "You can't outrun what you've done." Jake's truck screeched to a halt as the road suddenly ended, replaced by a thick forest that hadn't been there before. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop mere inches from the trees. The woman appeared in front of the truck, her hollow eyes staring through the windshield. The last thing Jake saw was her hand pressing against the glass, her voice whispering in his ears, "Time to pay your debt." When rescue crews found Jake's truck the next morning, it was empty. The driver's seatbelt was buckled, and the engine was still running, but Jake was nowhere to be found. Olivia Turner adjusted her rearview mirror and sighed. The rain was relentless, pounding against her car windows as she navigated the nearly deserted streets of the city. It was nearing 3 a.m., and her rideshare app was eerily quiet. She considered calling it a night when a ping came through. The pickup location was close, a small diner on the outskirts of the city. The name on the request read Andrew. Olivia accepted the ride and turned her car toward the diner. The roads were slick, and her wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear. As she approached the location, her headlights illuminated a lone figure standing under the diner's flickering neon sign. Andrew H. was a tall man in his late 30s, dressed in a black suit that seemed oddly formal for the time and weather. His face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but Olivia noticed how pale his skin appeared. She rolled down the passenger window slightly. "Andrew?" He nodded, his movements slow and deliberate. Without a word, he opened the back door and slid in. Olivia glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Long night?" she asked, trying to make small talk. Andrew's gaze met hers in the mirror. His eyes were dark, almost black, and uncomfortably intense. "You could say that," he replied, his voice low and calm. She shivered, though the car's heater was on. The destination Andrew entered into the app was over 30 minutes away, deep into the suburbs. Olivia hesitated for a moment, but decided to proceed. The ride started in silence. Olivia was used to quiet passengers, but something about Andrew's presence felt oppressive. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, his face devoid of any emotion. "Busy night for you?" she asked, her voice breaking the tension. Andrew smiled faintly. "Not as busy as yours." His response sent a chill down her spine, but she forced a polite laugh. As they drove further from the city, the streets grew darker and emptier. The rain intensified, and Olivia's GPS began glitching, the route recalibrating every few seconds. "Sorry about this," she said, trying to mask her growing unease. "The GPS gets weird in bad weather." Andrew didn't respond. The car passed a streetlight, and for a brief moment, the interior of the car lit up. Olivia caught a glimpse of Andrew's reflection in the rearview mirror, or rather, the lack of it. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as her heart raced. She glanced back quickly, and Andrew was still sitting there, staring out the window. "It's just the light," she told herself, though she didn't entirely believe it. The GPS recalibrated again, this time instructing her to take an unfamiliar turn down a narrow, tree-lined road. Olivia hesitated. "Are you sure this is the right way?" she asked, glancing at Andrew. "It's the only way," he said, his voice calm but final. "Wait." The road was unpaved and barely visible through the rain. Trees loomed on either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little moonlight there was. Olivia's unease grew with every passing second. The silence was broken by a low rumble. At first, she thought it was thunder, but the sound didn't fade. It grew louder, accompanied by a faint vibration in the car. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Andrew leaned forward slightly, his face still obscured by the hat. "You're almost there." "Almost where?" she demanded, panic creeping into her voice. He didn't answer. The rumble grew deafening, and the car's headlights flickered. Olivia slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a halt. "That's it," she said, turning to face Andrew. "I'm not going any further. You need to get out." Andrew met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You agreed to take me," he said softly. "Well, I'm changing my mind," she snapped, reaching for the door handle. But the handle wouldn't budge, neither would the locks. Panic set in as she frantically tried to open the door. "You can't leave," Andrew said, his voice now cold and emotionless. "Not yet." Olivia turned back to him, and her blood ran cold. Andrew's face had changed. His eyes were now completely black, and his skin had taken on an ashen hue. "You're not real," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Andrew leaned closer, his voice echoing in her mind. "I'm as real as the promises you broke." Confusion and fear collided in Olivia's mind. "What are you talking about?" "You left her," he said, his tone filled with quiet fury. "You left her on this very road alone in the rain. Do you remember now?" Images flashed through Olivia's mind, memories she had tried to bury. Years ago, she had abandoned a friend during an argument, leaving her stranded on a rainy night. That friend had never made it home. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That wasn't my fault." Andrew smiled, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. "You've been running from it ever since, but tonight it's time to stop." The car began moving on its own, speeding down the dark road. Olivia clutched the wheel, but it was unresponsive. Outside, the rain seemed to freeze mid-air, the droplets hanging like tiny crystals. Andrew leaned back, his expression calm once more. "This is where it ends," he said. The car screeched to a halt in front of an old rusted gate. Beyond it lay a cemetery, the headstones barely visible in the fog. Olivia's door unlocked with a loud click. "Go," Andrew said, gesturing toward the gate. Trembling, Olivia stepped out of the car. The rain resumed, soaking her instantly. She turned to beg Andrew for mercy, but the car was empty. Her heart raced as she turned toward the cemetery. There, illuminated by a single flickering light, was a fresh grave. The headstone bore her name. Edgar Collins had worked as the graveyard keeper of Willow Grove Cemetery for over 30 years. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it suited him. He liked the peace, the solitude, and the simplicity of maintaining the grounds. It was a rainy October evening, and Edgar was finishing his last rounds. His lantern swung in his hand, casting flickering shadows across the rows of headstones. The rain soaked through his heavy coat, but he didn't mind. As he walked toward the caretaker's shack, a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. He paused to glance at the horizon, where flashes of lightning illuminated the dark clouds. "Looks like a storm's coming," he muttered to himself, quickening his pace. But then he saw it, a figure standing near one of the older graves, completely still. "Hey!" Edgar called out, his voice firm. "Cemetery's closed." The figure didn't respond. It was dressed in dark clothing, its back turned to him. Edgar grumbled under his breath. Teenagers often snuck into the cemetery to scare themselves, but they usually ran off when confronted. He approached the figure cautiously, his lantern held high. "Did you hear me? You're not supposed to be here." The figure turned slowly, and Edgar's breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and lifeless. She was dressed in a tattered black gown that clung to her thin frame. "I'm looking for someone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who?" Edgar asked, trying to steady his nerves. "My child," she replied, her gaze boring into him. Edgar frowned. "There's no one here but the dead, ma'am. You should head home before the storm hits." The woman took a step closer, her movements unnaturally smooth. "My child was buried here, but I can't find the grave." Her words sent a chill down Edgar's spine. He had an almost photographic memory of the cemetery's layout. No one had buried a child in decades. "I don't recall any graves like that," he said carefully. "Maybe you've got the wrong cemetery." The woman's expression darkened. "This is the place," she said firmly. "I need to find my child." Before Edgar could respond, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. His lantern flickered, and for a moment the woman seemed to vanish. When the light steadied, she was standing much closer, her hollow eyes fixed on him. Edgar's heart raced as he took a step back. "All right, ma'am, I'll help you look," he said, hoping to diffuse the tension. She nodded, her expression unreadable. Edgar turned toward the rows of graves, his mind scrambling for answers. "Do you know the name?" he asked over his shoulder. "Matthew Collins," she said. Edgar froze. His lantern shook in his hand. "That's my son's name," he whispered. "I know," the woman replied. Edgar spun around, but she was gone. The lantern's light illuminated only empty air. The rain intensified as Edgar stumbled through the cemetery, his mind racing. His son, Matthew, had died in a car accident nearly 20 years ago. He had buried him in a quiet corner of the cemetery, marked with a small headstone. But when he reached the grave, his heart dropped. The ground was disturbed, the soil freshly turned. The headstone lay shattered in pieces. "Who did this?" Edgar shouted into the storm. A soft, childlike laugh echoed behind him. He turned to see a boy standing near the trees, his clothes muddy and torn. "Dad?" the boy said, his voice trembling. Edgar's knees nearly gave out. "Matthew?" The boy nodded, tears streaming down his dirty face. "Why did you leave me here?" I didn't," Edgar stammered, his voice cracking. "You were gone, I buried you." The boy shook his head. "You buried me alive." Memories flooded Edgar's mind, memories he had suppressed for years. Matthew's body had been cold and still when Edgar found him in the wreckage. The coroner had declared him dead. But what if they had been wrong? No, Edgar whispered, shaking his head. That's not possible. Matthew stepped closer, his small hands clenched into fists. I screamed for you. I begged you to save me, but you didn't hear me. You didn't listen. The wind howled around them, and Edgar fell to his knees. I'm sorry, he sobbed. I didn't know. I thought you were gone. The boy's expression softened for a moment, but then the woman reappeared behind him, her face twisted with anger. You let him suffer, she hissed. You left him to die alone. The ground beneath Edgar began to shift, the wet soil sucking at his boots. The woman and the boy stood side by side, their faces pale and accusing. I'm sorry, Edgar cried, his voice breaking. Please, forgive me. But they didn't respond. The earth opened beneath him, and he felt himself being pulled into the cold, suffocating soil. The last thing he saw was his son's face, staring down at him with a mix of sorrow and anger. When the new graveyard keeper arrived the following week, he found Edgar's lantern lying near a freshly filled grave. The grave had no marker, and no records indicated who was buried there. The townsfolk whispered that Edgar had been taken by the spirits of the cemetery, punished for his sins. But some said they still saw his lantern swinging in the distance on stormy nights, a silent figure tending the graves in eternal penance. It was a cold November night in 2017. My partner Jack and I had just finished a long shift when the radio crackled to life. Dispatch to Unit 4, we have a priority call. Single vehicle accident on the A75. Suspected fatality. The A75, also known as Scotland's most haunted road. It was infamous for strange sightings, figures appearing in the middle of the road, shadows darting between trees, drivers swerving to avoid people who weren't there. Jack groaned. Not the bloody A75. Last time we went out there, I swear I saw someone standing in the fog. We had no choice. We turned on the siren and sped through the empty road. By the time we reached the scene, the rain had turned into a fine mist. The wreckage of a car lay crumpled against a tree. The driver, a man in his mid-30s, had died on impact. No passengers, no signs of another living soul. Or so we thought. As we loaded the body onto the stretcher, I saw something or someone in the fog, a woman. She was standing on the side of the road, barefoot, wearing a long white dress, soaked from the rain. Her hair clung to her pale face. I stepped toward her. Ma'am, are you hurt? Were you in the vehicle? She didn't answer. She just stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Jack nudged me. Danny, let's go. We need to get the body back. When I turned back, she was gone. I told myself it was just the fog playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. We started driving back to the hospital. The road was quiet, empty. Jack was filling out paperwork in the passenger seat while I focused on the road. Then a movement in the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, there she was, the woman, sitting in the back of the ambulance right next to the covered body bag. My grip tightened on the wheel, my breath caught in my throat. Jack, don't freak out, but we're not alone. Jack turned, his face instantly draining of color. The woman just sat there, motionless, her hollow eyes locked onto me through the mirror. Then she smiled. The lights inside the ambulance flickered. The siren stuttered. The temperature dropped so fast that I could see my own breath. The woman slowly tilted her head. Then she whispered something so faint I barely caught it. He's not dead. A chill ran down my spine. The stretcher behind her shifted. Then a loud gasp erupted from the body bag. Jack screamed. I slammed the brakes. The ambulance skidded to a halt. I turned around just in time to see the zipper of the body bag slowly unzipping from the inside. The dead man inside sat up, his face twisted in terror. The next moments were chaos. Jack and I leaped from our seats, scrambling to assess the situation. The man inside the bag, Paul Henshaw, 36 years old, was very much alive. His pulse was weak but steady. He was supposed to be dead. We immediately rushed him to the hospital, where doctors confirmed the unthinkable. He had been mispronounced dead at the scene due to a slowed heart rate from extreme shock and hypothermia. If we hadn't stopped, he would have suffocated inside the bag. But here's the part that still keeps me awake at night. When we checked the ambulance footage, there was no sign of the woman. No one had seen her. No one except me and Jack. A few days later, Paul regained consciousness. He was shaken, confused. But when I asked him about the accident, his face turned pale. I remember losing control of the car, hitting the tree, and then I saw her. Who? I asked. The woman. She was standing on the road. I tried to avoid her. That's why I crashed. I felt my blood turn to ice. What did she look like? He described her perfectly, right down to the soaked white dress. I still don't know who she was. A spirit? A guardian angel? A lost soul lingering on the A75? But I do know this. She saved a life that night. And sometimes when I drive alone at night, I check my rearview mirror, just to make sure I'm truly alone. Michael Harris was used to working late. As a senior executive in a major tech company, long hours were part of the job. Tonight, however, was different. The city was unusually quiet for a Wednesday evening, the streets empty as a heavy rain fell, slapping against the windows. He checked the time, 11:45 p.m. His final meeting had just ended, and he was the only one left in the office building. He grabbed his coat and briefcase and made his way to the elevator. The building was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights casting long, sharp shadows across the hallway. As he entered the elevator, the doors closed with a soft chime, and the soothing hum of the elevator's machinery filled the space. "Going down?" the voice on the intercom asked. "Yes, please," Michael replied, pressing the button for the ground floor. The elevator began its descent, and Michael leaned back against the wall, tired but ready to go home. The low hum of the machine was almost hypnotic, and his eyes fluttered shut for a moment. Suddenly, the elevator jerked to a stop. Michael shot upright, his heart racing. The lights flickered, and the intercom crackled with static. "Excuse me?" he called out, looking at the elevator panel. The numbers were frozen at the 12th floor. He pressed the button for the ground floor again, but nothing happened. The elevator didn't move. "Hello?" Michael called again, his voice echoing. "Is anyone there?" There was no response. The only sound was the hum of the elevator. He checked his phone, but there was no signal. His anxiety began to rise. He tried pressing the emergency button, but it only produced more static on the intercom. Then something odd happened. A faint sound began to come from the corner of the elevator, a scraping noise like nails on metal. Michael turned to look, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The scraping sound stopped as quickly as it started. Shaken, Michael tried to force the doors open, but they wouldn't budge. Panic started creeping in. He took deep breaths, trying to calm himself, but the feeling of claustrophobia was overwhelming. After a few moments of silence, a voice came from the darkness, low and hollow. "Help me." Michael froze. He strained his ears, trying to locate the source of the voice. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling. The voice replied, distant and faint. I can't breathe." Michael's heart pounded. The voice sounded like it was coming from below, from beneath the floor of the elevator itself. He stepped back, his hands trembling as he gripped the walls. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But then the voice spoke again, louder this time. "Get me out. Help me. Get me out." Michael's blood ran cold. He could hear the desperation in the voice, a terrified plea. Without thinking, he dropped to his knees and started pulling at the panel on the elevator floor. His hands fumbled, his fingers shaking, but he had to find out what was making that sound. As the panel came loose, the scraping sound started again, louder and more frantic. Michael lifted the panel completely, and as he did, he caught a glimpse of something horrifying, beneath the elevator. A pale, bony hand reached out, gripping the underside of the elevator. Michael gasped, his breath caught in his throat. He quickly slammed the panel back into place, but the hand had already disappeared. His mind raced. What was that? Who was trapped beneath the elevator? The voice came again, now a deep, gurgling rasp. "Please, help me." His body froze in fear, his pulse hammering in his ears. Every instinct told him to get out, to leave the building, but his feet remained glued to the floor of the elevator. The lights flickered once more, and the elevator started moving again this time. It was going up. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as the elevator ascended. The numbers on the panel ticked up slowly, reaching the 10th floor, then the 11th. The voice from beneath him grew louder, its gurgling breaths more pronounced. "Help me, please." Suddenly, the elevator stopped again, this time between the 13th and 14th floors. Michael felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. The lights flickered and went out, leaving him in pitch darkness. He could still hear the voice, now closer than before. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a deep, anguished scream. "Help me. Get me out." The elevator jolted violently, as if something was trying to break through the floor. Michael's chest tightened, and he could feel the temperature drop in the small metal box. The air was thick, heavy with dread. Just as he thought he couldn't take it any longer, the elevator began to descend once more. The lights flickered back on, and Michael's eyes widened in disbelief. The numbers on the panel showed the elevator was going down to the basement level, where there was no exit, no ground floor. When the elevator reached the basement, the doors opened with a soft ping. Michael stepped out, his legs weak beneath him. The hallway beyond the elevator was pitch black, the only sound, the distant hum of machinery. As he stepped out further, he noticed something in the corner of his eye, a figure standing motionless in the darkness, staring at him with hollow eyes. He froze, paralyzed with fear, unable to move. The figure started to move towards him, its footsteps echoing in the dark hallway. "Who are you?" Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out for him with a skeletal hand, its fingers long and pale, like they belonged to something dead. The voice from before returned, now echoing in his head, louder and louder. "Help me! You're the one who can help me!" In a blind panic, Michael turned and ran down the hallway, the sound of the figure's footsteps behind him growing louder and faster. He turned corners, desperately trying to find an exit, but the walls stretched on endlessly. Every door he tried was locked. Suddenly, the floor beneath him gave way. Michael screamed as he fell into an endless black abyss. The next morning, the elevator was found on the ground floor, its doors open. The security footage showed Michael entering the elevator, but nothing more. The building was thoroughly searched, but no trace of him was ever found. However, the strange thing was the footage of the elevator. It had recorded an unknown figure, the pale, skeletal figure appearing only in the elevator, its face distorted and unrecognizable. Michael Harris was never seen again. Jessica Millard had taken the graveyard shift at the Oak Hill Cemetery for 2 reasons. The pay was decent, and it was quiet. A small cemetery at the edge of town, Oak Hill had long been neglected. The old iron gates were rusted, and the gravestones, many of which were crumbling, seemed to belong to another time. Jessica wasn't superstitious, and she had never been afraid of the dark. The job was simple enough. Sit in the tiny security booth, watch the cameras, and patrol the grounds every hour. The only people who came here after sunset were a few locals paying their respects to departed loved ones, but they never stayed long. On her first night, she thought the job would be a breeze, but by the third night, she started to feel something in the air that made her skin crawl. It began with the sound of footsteps. At first, she thought it was just the wind or the rustling of leaves. But as she walked the grounds during her rounds, she noticed something. The footprints in the soft dirt by the old mausoleum. They were fresh. Too fresh. Jessica's heart skipped a beat as she glanced around. The cemetery was completely empty. She checked the camera feeds, nothing. But when she stepped closer to the mausoleum, she saw it. A figure standing at the entrance, just out of reach of the camera's view. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Jessica's breath hitched. She took a step back. "This isn't funny." The figure remained still, as though it had never heard her. Then, without warning, it turned and walked away into the shadows. The night gets darker. Her pulse racing, Jessica returned to the security booth and locked the door behind her. She tried to shake off the encounter, blaming it on fatigue. Maybe someone had snuck in, or perhaps it was just her imagination. But as the hours ticked by, the unease settled in. Every time she glanced at the cameras, something was off. Shadows moved unnaturally, and sometimes she could swear she saw figures standing just out of sight. She was just about to begin her next round when the radio crackled to life. "Jessica, come in," a voice said, static hissing in the background. She grabbed the walkie-talkie. "What is it?" "Check the cemetery," the voice responded urgently. "Someone's in there. We've got no records of anyone entering tonight." Her blood ran cold. "I'm already inside," she replied, her voice tight with fear. "Then who's walking around out there?" the voice asked. Jessica didn't need any more convincing. She grabbed the flashlight and made her way back into the cemetery. The night air was heavy, the kind of cold that made every breath feel sharp. As she walked along the row of tombstones, she heard a low murmur, a sound she couldn't quite place. It wasn't human. It was more like a whispering wind, but it carried voices. When she reached the old mausoleum, she froze. The figure from before was there again, standing motionless in front of a crypt. "Who are you?" she called, stepping closer, her voice shaking. The figure turned, revealing an old man with hollow eyes and a sunken face. He was dressed in old, ragged clothes, as though he had just crawled out of the grave himself. His mouth opened, and a low, rasping voice emerged. "Leave now, girl. It's not safe for you here." Jessica recoiled. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The man's face twisted into a grimace. "I was the gravekeeper before you. I tried to warn them all. They never listened." His voice faltered, as if something was choking him. Suddenly he collapsed, his body crumpling to the ground with an eerie finality. Terrified, Jessica ran back to the security booth and locked herself in again. She tried to call the cemetery office, but there was no answer. The walkie-talkie went silent. Desperate for contact, she texted her boyfriend, but the message failed to send. As the hours passed, Jessica's anxiety grew. The cameras started malfunctioning one by one, flashing static before cutting to black. Her phone battery drained, even though she hadn't used it much. Then the whispers returned, louder now. They seemed to be coming from every direction, swirling around her in an unnatural breeze. "Help us! Help us! Come back! Come back!" The words were barely audible, but they echoed in her mind, repeating over and over again. Jessica clutched her head, unable to stop the sounds. She stepped outside, the cold air biting at her skin. The cemetery stretched out before her, impossibly dark. There was no moon, and the only light was from the flickering street lamp near the entrance. Then she saw it. a shadow moving across the cemetery, just beyond the reach of the light. The shadow grew, stretching unnaturally long, its form taking shape as it moved closer to her. It was a tall figure, draped in black, its face hidden beneath a hood. As the figure approached, Jessica realized with growing dread that the shadow was not just a person, it was something far worse. It stopped a few feet from her, and a cold breath seemed to brush against her face. "Who are you?" Jessica whispered, her voice breaking. The figure lifted its head slowly, revealing a face so pale it looked as though it had been washed clean of all life. Its eyes were nothing but black voids, and its mouth was stretched into a thin, cruel smile. "You shouldn't have come back," it hissed, its voice like the scrape of nails on a chalkboard. Jessica tried to scream, but her voice failed her. The air grew heavy, thick with dread. She turned to run, but the shadow moved with unnatural speed, blocking her path. "You belong here now," the figure whispered, its voice a deathly rasp. The cemetery gate, which had been locked the entire time, creaked open on its own. Jessica stumbled backward as the figure advanced, her legs giving out beneath her. The last thing she saw was the glowing eyes of the figure drawing closer, and then darkness. The next morning, a jogger passing by the cemetery found the security booth open, but no sign of Jessica. The gates were unlocked, and the grass by the mausoleum was disturbed, as though something had been dragged through it. Her phone was found at the entrance, the screen cracked. When the police examined the footage from the security cameras, they discovered only static, except for one moment. A figure standing in front of the mausoleum, staring directly at the camera with eyes too empty to be human. Jessica Miller was never found. Logan Turner hated working late, but the project deadline loomed, and he had no choice. By the time he wrapped up, it was almost midnight. Too tired to drive himself home, he booked a rideshare through an app. The car arrived quickly, a sleek black sedan. The driver's name displayed as Gerald, with a profile picture of a middle-aged man wearing glasses. "Logan?" the driver asked, rolling down the window slightly. His voice was calm, almost soothing. "Yeah, that's me," Logan replied, climbing into the back seat. The interior was impeccably clean, but it smelled faintly of something metallic, like rust. Logan chalked it up to his overactive imagination. The car merged onto the highway, and Logan leaned back, hoping to catch some rest. But something felt off. The GPS screen on the dashboard was dark. Logan noticed there was no faint glow of a phone mount either. "So, how do you know where you're going without the GPS?" he asked. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his eyes oddly intense. "I've driven this route 1,000 times. Don't worry, I'll get you there." Logan nodded, but felt a knot tightening in his stomach. He tried to shake it off. As the car sped down the highway, Logan noticed they were heading in the wrong direction. The familiar city lights disappeared behind them, replaced by dense woods on either side of the road. "Hey, I think you missed the exit," Logan said, sitting up straighter. "No," Gerald replied flatly. "This is the way." "No, it's not," Logan insisted, his voice rising. "I know the route to my place. Turn around." Gerald didn't respond. His grip on the wheel tightened, and the car seemed to accelerate. Panic began to creep in. Logan pulled out his phone to check the route, but he had no signal. The app displayed a loading screen that refused to change. "Stop the car," Logan demanded. The driver's eyes met his in the mirror again, and a chilling smile spread across his face. "You're almost there." Suddenly, Logan became aware of a faint sound, a whispering, low and guttural. He turned his head, his heart pounding. The back seat of the car seemed empty, but the whispers grew louder surrounding him. It sounded like a chorus of voices, all speaking in an incomprehensible language. "What is that?" Logan shouted. Gerald didn't answer. Logan's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. For a split second, he thought he saw someone or something sitting beside him. A pale face with hollow eyes staring at him with an eerie stillness. He whipped around, but the seat was empty. The car veered off the main highway onto a narrow, unpaved road. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches scraping against the windows like claws. Logan's panic boiled over. "Pull over! Let me out!" The driver's smile widened unnaturally, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. "You wanted a ride. I'm taking you where you belong." Logan grabbed the door handle and yanked, but it wouldn't budge. The locks clicked in unison, trapping him inside. "You're insane!" he shouted, pounding on the window. Gerald chuckled, his voice low and menacing. "You're not the first passenger to say that." The car slowed as they approached a clearing. In the middle of the road stood a woman in a torn white dress, her hair matted and covering her face. Gerald stopped the car and rolled down his window. "No, no, no," Logan muttered, his voice trembling. "Don't stop." But Gerald ignored him. The woman stepped closer, her movements jerky and unnatural. She reached out and touched the car, leaving a bloody handprint on the window. "Get her away from the car," Logan screamed. Gerald turned to him with a calm expression. "Why? She's coming with us." The woman opened the back door and slid into the seat next to Logan. Her head turned slowly toward him, revealing a face that was barely human. Her skin was gray and cracked, her eyes glowing faintly. Logan pressed himself against the door, his entire body shaking. "What is this? What's happening?" Neither the driver nor the woman answered. The car began to move again, but the chlorine didn't fade. It was as if they were driving in circles, passing the same trees, the same shadows. Logan checked his phone again, desperate for a signal. The screen lit up, but instead of the rideshare app, a single message filled the display. "You should have stayed home." His breath caught as the car slowed once more. This time they stopped in front of a massive, rusted gate. Beyond it, an old mansion loomed, its windows glowing faintly with an unnatural light. "This is your stop," Gerald said, turning to face him. His eyes were now black pits, void of any humanity. "I'm not getting out," Logan whispered, tears streaming down his face. The woman beside him leaned closer, her breath cold against his neck. "You don't have a choice." Before Logan could react, the door unlocked and swung open. The woman grabbed his arm with icy fingers and pulled him out of the car. The gate creaked open, and Logan was dragged toward the mansion. The whispers surrounded him again, louder now, chanting in a language he couldn't understand. He turned to look back at the car, but it was gone. The mansion doors opened, revealing nothing but darkness. The woman shoved him forward, and the last thing he heard was the sound of the gate slamming shut behind him. The next morning, a black sedan was found abandoned on the highway. The driver's seat was empty, but the back seat was smeared with blood. Logan's phone was found inside, displaying a photo of him sitting in the back seat, smiling though his eyes were hollow and lifeless. Logan Turner was never seen again. Natalie James had a habit of chasing the unusual. As a freelance photographer specializing in urban decay, she had visited countless abandoned places, crumbling factories, decrepit theaters, and forgotten homes. But tonight, her focus was on the old Crescent Station, an abandoned railway depot rumored to be haunted. It was just past midnight when Natalie arrived. The station sat at the edge of town, shrouded in fog and silence. Its rusted roof sagged, and the wooden planks of the platform creaked under her boots. She set up her camera and tripod, excited to capture the eerie beauty of the station. As she adjusted her lens, she noticed an old train car still sitting on the rusted tracks. Its windows were broken and its paint had faded, but it seemed oddly preserved. "This will be the perfect centerpiece," she whispered to herself, snapping the first shot. As the shutter clicked, Natalie heard a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. She froze, listening intently. The sound seemed to be coming from the train car. Her breath quickened, but she convinced herself it was just the wind rattling the old metal. Curiosity got the better of her. Gripping her flashlight, she approached the car. The door was slightly ajar, revealing the dark interior. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing in the silence. No response. She climbed the steps and pushed the door open. The musty smell of decay hit her immediately. Inside, rows of torn seats stretched into the darkness. As her flashlight swept across the interior, she thought she saw a figure at the far end, a shadow that moved out of sight. "Probably an animal," she muttered, though she didn't entirely believe it. Natalie moved cautiously down the aisle, her camera at the ready. She passed seat after seat, each more decrepit than the last. The train car seemed impossibly long, as if it stretched far beyond what she had seen from the outside. She stopped when she noticed a folded piece of paper tucked into one of the seats. It was yellowed with age, but the words were still legible. "Passenger Manifest, Crescent Station Departure, October 25th, 1935. Her fingers trembled as she read the names. Each one had a note scrawled beside it. Departed, missing, unknown. The last name on the list caught her eye, Natalie James. Her heart raced as the paper slipped from her hands. She hadn't noticed her name at first, but there it was, written in ink that hadn't faded with time. "This can't be real," she whispered, backing away. A low whistle echoed through the car, and the floor beneath her feet vibrated. Natalie spun around, her flashlight beam darting across the empty seats. Then she saw him, a man in a faded conductor's uniform, standing at the far end of the car. His face was pale and his eyes were sunken, but his posture was rigid and formal. "Ticket, please," he said, his voice deep and hollow. I'm not a passenger," Natalie stammered, backing toward the door. The conductor tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Everyone is a passenger, eventually." Natalie turned and bolted toward the exit, but the door was no longer there. The aisle stretched endlessly, the seats blurring together as if the train car were expanding around her. The sound of the whistle grew louder, and the train lurched as if it were moving. Natalie grabbed onto a nearby seat to steady herself. She heard voices now, whispers overlapping in a chilling chorus. Turning her head, she saw the seats were no longer empty. Passengers filled the car, their faces pale and emotionless. Some stared out the broken windows, while others gazed directly at her. "Where am I?" Natalie shouted, her voice trembling. "You're on your final journey," the conductor replied, appearing beside her without warning. She stumbled away from him, her back pressing against a window. The glass was cold, but when she looked outside, there was nothing but darkness. Desperate to escape, Natalie ran down the aisle, past rows of blank-faced passengers. No matter how far she ran, the end of the car never came. "Let me out!" she screamed, slamming her fists against the walls. The whispers grew louder, their words becoming clear. "You belong here. You can't leave. It's your time." Natalie collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face. She pulled her camera from her bag and turned it on, desperate to document what was happening. When she looked through the viewfinder, the train car appeared normal, empty, and decayed. But when she lowered the camera, the passengers and the conductor were still there, staring at her. The train screeched to a halt, and the passengers stood in unison. The conductor extended a gloved hand toward Natalie. "This is your stop," he said. Before she could protest, she was lifted to her feet by an unseen force and guided toward the door, which had reappeared. The moment she stepped outside, she was blinded by light. When her vision cleared, she found herself standing in a bustling train station filled with people, But something was off. The people were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, and the signs read, Crescent Station, 1935. Natalie's camera slipped from her hands as she realized where she was. Looking down at her feet, she saw a newspaper lying on the ground. The headline read, Freelance Photographer Missing, Last Seen Near Abandoned Crescent Station. The date was today. Natalie's scream echoed through the station as the passengers closed in around her, their faces now twisted into grotesque grins. The last thing she saw was the conductor tipping his hat before everything went dark. Natalie's camera was discovered weeks later, lying on the platform of Crescent Station. The photos inside were haunting. Empty train cars, foggy landscapes, and, in the final image, a blurred figure in a conductor's uniform staring directly at the lens. No trace of Natalie was ever found.